There is a question nobody asks, not because it lacks an answer, but because the answer is quiet, and quiet things do not trend. We study how fortunes were built. We read about the investments, the industries, the moments of timing that turned modest capital into generational wealth. We model the portfolios. We track the strategies. We consume endless content about getting more. But there is an older, more durable question, and almost no one puts it on a bestseller list. How did certain families not lose everything when nearly everyone around them did? Not once. Across multiple collapses, across wars, currency resets, depressions, and political upheavals that destroyed the wealth of people who seemed, by every visible measure, to be doing everything right. I have spent years reading the private letters, the estate records, the accounting ledgers of families that survived what should have consumed them. And what I found was not a portfolio strategy. It was a posture, a set of quiet, almost invisible habits, so deeply internalized they were never written down as rules, because they were not thought of as rules. They were simply, as one Florentine merchant patriarch described in the 1400s, the way that sensible people conduct themselves. Today, we are going to excavate those habits, not to copy them as financial tactics, but to understand where they came from, why they worked, and what, precisely, they were protecting against. Because that threat has not disappeared. It has simply changed its clothing. I want to start with a moment of recognition. Think about how you respond, financially, when things feel uncertain. When the news is alarming, when markets fall, when a colleague mentions an opportunity that won't be there next week, when you sense that other people are moving and you are standing still, what do? Most people accelerate. They look for something to do. They rebalance. They react. They move capital. They make decisions. They act in proportion to the urgency they feel. This is not a character flaw. It is a completely logical response to the environment most of us grew up in, and the environment that most modern financial culture actively reinforces. But here is what I observed, consistently, across the families that preserved wealth across generations. When things felt uncertain, they slowed down, not from paralysis, not from ignorance. They slowed deliberately, as if deceleration itself was a practiced discipline, something earned and maintained, like a muscle. And when I began excavating where this habit came from, the answer was not what I expected. Let me take you to a specific moment in history. The year 1813. Napoleonic Europe is fracturing. The French Empire is retreating from Moscow in catastrophic disorder. Currencies are collapsing and being reissued within months. Governments that existed 5 years prior no longer exist. Entire fortunes built on state bonds, aristocratic land grants, and merchant credit have evaporated in the span of a single season. Nathan Mayer Rothschild is sitting in London watching this unfold. The Rothschild family at this moment is not rich in the way we mean rich today. They are solvent. They are liquid. They hold assets in multiple countries through multiple family branches: Frankfurt, London, Paris, Vienna, Naples, in multiple forms, in multiple currencies. But more than that, and this is the part most histories skip, they are not making major decisions based on what they hope will happen. They are making decisions based on the assumption that everything they have built could be destroyed. This was not pessimism. It was the inherited logic of a family that had watched the Frankfurt ghetto, their home, their entire community, be stripped of rights, of savings, of accumulated property, multiple times across 3 generations. The behavior was adaptive. The environment had taught them, with documented historical precision, that wealth was not a permanent condition. It was a temporary permission that could be revoked. So they built habits around a different foundational assumption. Not, what will I gain, but what can I not afford to lose? And when you internalize that question at the structural level, something specific happens to how you behave. You stop treating your current balance as your permanent status. You stop making irreversible decisions under pressure. You hold reserves that appear to outside observers excessive, wasteful even. You do not discuss what you have, because visibility, historically, creates vulnerability. And you become instinctively, almost allergically, resistant to urgency. Because urgency, the sensation that you must act now, that this moment is uniquely decisive, is historically almost always a manufactured condition. And manufactured urgency is almost always designed to benefit someone other than you. Now let me show you this same pattern in a completely different context. The year is 1929, October. In New York, the financial system is fragmenting in real time. Brokers are ruined. Businesses built over decades are insolvent by Thursday afternoon. The stories we all know. But there is a less told story, happening simultaneously, in the old merchant families of coastal New England. Let me introduce you to one of them. His name was Thomas, 61 years old in 1929. His family had been in the shipping trade since the 1700s. Not spectacularly wealthy by the standards of the decade's newly minted fortunes, but continuously, quietly, solvent for nearly 2 centuries. Thomas lost money in the crash. Let me be precise. He was not immune. His portfolio declined. Certain positions went to zero. But Thomas did not lose his foundation. His contemporaries, the men who had leveraged their portfolios on margin, who had confused the prosperity of the 1920s for a permanent new reality of American wealth, they were destroyed. Not just reduced, destroyed. Thomas was not destroyed, because he had inherited a concept that had been in his family since before the American Revolution. The concept was almost embarrassingly simple. His grandfather had written it in a letter in 1847, and it was still kept in the family's papers. The principal is not yours to spend. The income is yours. The principal belongs to your grandchildren. They maintained a strict, non-negotiable separation between the capital they had accumulated and the income that capital generated. They did not spend capital. They did not borrow against capital. They did not invest capital in schemes that promised to accelerate its growth dramatically in the short term. They lived on what the capital produced, and they treated the capital itself as structurally untouchable, the way you treat the foundation of a building. You do not mine the foundation for building materials, even when you need more room. This was not a portfolio strategy. It was a belief about what money is. And I want to be precise here, because I read a great deal of financial history, and I am not your financial advisor. I am something closer to a historian of these patterns. What I can tell you is what the records show about how certain families behaved, and what distinguished those behaviors from the behaviors of families who did not survive the same conditions. The records are clear on this point. It was not the instruments they held. It was the belief underneath the instruments. Capital is the engine. Income is what the engine produces. You operate the machine. You do not consume it. When I encountered this principle across multiple family archives, across the Rothschild correspondence in Europe, the old New England merchant records, the traditional Japanese merchant house documents that survived the Meiji Restoration, and the private papers of South American trading families that preserved stability through cycles of political upheaval, this same architectural concept appeared in different languages, with different metaphors, but identical structure. They all understood, somewhere in their inherited orientation toward money, that preservation and growth are not the same objective, and that preservation must be established first. Here is where we need to pause and look honestly at the gap between then and now. The context that formed these habits was one of genuine, documented, catastrophic risk. Governments fell within years. Currencies were destroyed by decree. Property was confiscated. Wars erased the legal architecture that had protected ownership for generations. In that environment, these habits were not wisdom handed down from tranquil libraries. They were survival strategies, forged in real loss. But here is what I want you to consider for a moment. Most people watching this, in stable, developed economies, have never experienced that category of financial catastrophe. Your bank account has not been seized by a collapsing regime. Your currency has not been reset to zero overnight. Your assets have not been confiscated because your government changed. And yet, the core mechanism these habits were designed to protect against, the mechanism has not disappeared. It has become more subtle, more ambient, more invisible, precisely because it does not announce itself as a crisis. Urgency is still manufactured, and it still transfers wealth from those who react to those who are patient. The transaction happens in different forms, but the direction is the same. Capital is still confused with income at massive scale, which is why so many people who earn substantial salaries remain, in practical terms, financially fragile, one disruption away from difficulty. Visibility still creates vulnerability, not through confiscation, but through lifestyle inflation, social comparison, and consumption patterns that erode net worth gradually, invisibly, over decades, without any single month that feels like a crisis. The context changed. The threat did not vanish. It simply became quieter. And here is the crucial observation about quiet patterns. The families who survived catastrophe internalized their protective habits so completely that the habits became invisible to them. They were not consciously thinking about historical currency collapses when they made daily financial decisions. They were simply, as I said, behaving the way sensible people conduct themselves. But for most people today, those habits were never installed. They were raised in environments where different signals were dominant, where the visible markers of financial arrival, what you spend, what you display, what you consume, were treated as the point, not as a flaw in those environments, as the logical response to them. If you grew up in a context where financial security felt uncertain, spending what you had while you had it was entirely rational. It was the correct response to real conditions. If you grew up in a context where social belonging was signaled through consumption, managing appearances was not vanity. It was social strategy. If you grew up watching adults respond to financial stress with urgency and decisive action, you learned that the correct response to threat is acceleration. These were not mistakes. They were adaptations, completely sensible responses to the environments that formed them. The problem is not that those responses were wrong. The problem is that the context has changed and the pattern stayed. So let us look at the habits themselves, and more importantly, at the question underneath each one. The first, the structural separation of capital and income. This is not an accounting technique. It is a foundational belief. The families I studied did not need a spreadsheet to enforce it. They did not need a rule or a system. The belief was structural. Capital is the machine. Income is what the machine produces. You operate the machine. You do not dismantle it for parts. The question to ask yourself is not, how do I set up a separate account? That is a tool. And tools are useful only when the belief underneath them is solid. The real question is, do you actually believe at the structural level that the money you have accumulated is a different category of thing from the money you earn this month? If the belief is not there, the accounting structure will not hold. It never does for long. The second, an allergy to manufactured urgency. The families who preserved wealth across generations learned through repeated historical experience that almost every once-in-a-lifetime opportunity and almost every act now or miss everything scenario was manufactured, not always maliciously, sometimes by people who genuinely believed it themselves, but manufactured nonetheless. The structural pattern was consistent across centuries. Urgency is the mechanism by which patient capital is transferred to impatient actors. The habit they developed sounds obvious, but it is genuinely rare in practice. They never made irreversible financial decisions quickly. Not never quickly in terms of speed, quickly in terms of pressure, under the sensation of urgency. A phrase appears in the correspondence of a Florentine merchant family in the 1500s that I find unusually precise. A decision made in heat cools into a chain. The question to ask yourself is not, should I slow down? The question is the urgency I am feeling right now arising from the situation itself, or is it being produced by someone who benefits from my haste? Those are different questions, and they produce different answers. The third, treating loss prevention as the primary architectural objective. This is the hardest for modern audiences, because the financial culture most of us live inside frames everything in terms of gain, returns, growth, performance, upside. The families who preserved wealth across multiple generational catastrophes did not think this way. They thought, first and foremost, about what they could not afford to lose, not as pessimism, as structure. If you design a building to survive earthquakes, you do not begin with the decorative elements. You begin with the foundation. The foundation is not the interesting part. It is the part you never want to think about, because you never want to need it. The practical translation of this habit is not invest conservatively. That is a portfolio description, not a belief. The belief is, I define my objectives first by what must be preserved, and then by what I would like to build. These are two completely different orientations. One of them has a multi-century historical track record of surviving conditions that destroyed the wealth of people who were, by every visible measure, doing well. The question to ask yourself is, when you think about your financial life, do you begin from what you want to build or from what you cannot afford to lose? The answer shapes everything that follows. Let me bring you back to where we began. The question nobody asks. Not how fortunes were made, but how certain fortunes were kept through everything that destroyed the ones around them. The families we examined did not have superior instruments. They did not have better information. In many cases, they operated with less capital than their contemporaries, who were subsequently ruined. What they had was a set of deeply installed beliefs about the nature of money, the nature of time, and the nature of risk. Beliefs that had been forged in environments where the cost of being wrong was genuinely catastrophic. And then the catastrophes came, and their habits held. These habits were not born as philosophy. They were born as survival. The families who developed them were not theorists. They were people who had watched their predecessors lose everything, or nearly everything, and who internalized the behavioral lessons of that loss so completely that the lessons became invisible. The habits were the correct response to the conditions. They were not excessive. They were proportionate to the actual risk those families faced. Now, consider this. We have not entered an era of zero financial risk. The risks have changed their form. The mechanisms are more complex, more distributed, more invisible. But the core dynamic, the one these families were protecting against, has not changed. Capital can be transferred away from you without violence, without drama, without any single identifiable moment when it happened. It happens through urgency that was never yours to feel. It happens through the slow confusion of what you have with what you have built. It happens through the quiet, patient attrition of a life that costs slightly more than it produces, year after year, without any single month that announces itself as a crisis. The families who never lost money were not smarter. They were slower. They were quieter. And they carried, somewhere in their inherited understanding of how the world works, a belief that the people around them simply did not share. That wealth is not a destination. It is a practice. And the practice is not glamorous. It does not trend. It does not produce dramatic stories or impressive screenshots. But it survives. History confirms this, not once, not twice, but across centuries of documented evidence, in the letters and ledgers and private family papers of people who made it through conditions that swallowed their neighbors whole. The noise of any given moment is temporary. The laws of how capital behaves across time, those are not temporary. And the next test, whatever form it takes, will not announce itself in advance. It never does. Modern noise is fleeting. The lessons of history are not. If you found this useful, consider what other quiet habits we have not yet excavated. The most durable ones are rarely discussed, because durability does not trend. The next time you feel urgency around a financial decision, pause for one breath. Ask yourself, is this urgency mine? Or was it placed here for someone else's benefit? That single question is worth more than most financial advice.